What does it take to be a leader in the church? That is a question that has been asked ever since the letters of Paul. The author of 1 Timothy wrote, "Now a bishop must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must arrange his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil." Well, that's certainly not the last time that folk have tried to make a list of desirable qualities in church leaders. In fact, often movements of reform were based on unhappiness with characteristics in the existing leadership. Sometimes it was morality, sometimes education, or lack of it rather, sometimes it was greed. It's quite common to hear boards and search committees say, "If only we had the right minister, everything would be okay." Obviously, that depicts a certain vision of leadership, and one I suggest to you that isn't very healthy. It reveals a particularly narrow and erroneous view of the body of Christ and the role of ministry personnel in that life. But there is no question that leaders today face different challenges than a generation ago. One of the aspects of leadership throughout the career that lies before you is change. Because I believe that leaders are made, I want to share with you some qualities you can consider developing in yourself. And so, in this session, we will consider leadership in changing times, understanding the dynamics of change, establishing priorities for leadership. Let's start by thinking about some of the concerns raised about leadership today. What can we learn from these concerns raised about Protestant clergy? Well, there are concerns about those leaders who seem more concerned about the institution than they are about parishioners. There are those who believe that leadership, any sort of leadership, means that we wouldn't have these problems, and there they can go to filling in that list of problems in any number of ways. There are concerns about autocratic leaders who care nothing for the opinion of others, and about weak leaders who can never make a decision. Now, if you've been listening carefully, you can see that there's conflicts within those problems, and solving one may simply exacerbate another. And so what's a leader to do? Well, one thing I can assure you is that the solution is not formulaic. In other words, no one can tell you what a good leader ought to look like or behave like. And if anyone tries to sell you a formula for leadership that is guaranteed to work in all circumstances, run the other way, fast. Another challenge that we often face in the church is that we tend to pick up leadership paradigms from the business world about 10 years after the business world has discarded them as unworkable. Let's back up a couple of hundred years. You may recognize the industrial paradigm of leadership. It concentrates on the structure and function of organization. It emphasizes management as a premier activity for leaders. It focuses on leaders in very personal terms. It's goal-oriented. It's expressed in primarily male-oriented terms. It focuses on rational, technocratic, linear, and quantitative standards, and it emphasizes the degree to which leadership is a property of the individual. It actually equates leadership and management. I'm sure you can see how this industrial paradigm works best in a situation where individuals and resources and processes are all seen simply as elements to be manipulated and moved into place for the best result. And although churches aren't much like that, it was a leadership model taught in seminaries for a number of decades. Now, discontent with that industrial model provided the seedbed for a concept of the transformational or the servant leader. Remember that these are models originating from the business world. From a Christian perspective, what is really intriguing is the emphasis on morality. Quoting from a major work of transformational leadership, we read that leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of motivation and morality. The moral dimension is something to keep in mind because many leadership views are articulated by management science and writers include some aspect of morality, and when the popular press bemoans a failure in leadership in major industries, it's generally talking about moral issues. Think of times in your life where there's been a major meltdown in an industry or in a particular firm, and there's talk about leadership. It usually has to do with morality and cutting moral corners as much as it has to do with issues financial and revenue-based. Now, servant leadership has a wonderful ring to it, and perhaps at different times you have been challenged, as I have been, to be a servant leader. Well, I want to balance that off with challenges that have arisen in recent years in Christian circles. These authors point out the words of Jesus himself. I no longer call you servants, but friends. At this point, I'd like you to pause the recording and spend a few moments brainstorming about what comes to mind when you think of servant leadership. It could be positive or negative. It may be that the term calls to mind certain individuals. And so do that for a few moments, please, and then come back. Thanks for doing that. I want to be clear that I don't think that by calling them friends, Jesus all of a sudden changed his style of leadership. Nor am I offering you Jesus as a model for you in ministry. I think trying to model ourselves on Jesus can become very dangerous in a number of ways. But in calling his disciples friends rather than servants, I'm suggesting to you that Jesus was declaring something fundamental about the tone of congregational leadership. There's another trend in leadership that has developed over some 20 years that I want to draw to your attention. This is a particularly early expression of the conviction. Leadership is an influence relationship among leaders and followers who intend real changes that reflect their mutual purposes. Leadership is an influence relationship amongst leaders and followers who intend real changes that reflect their mutual purposes. So, leadership is relational. Effective leadership is grounded in relationship. The quality of the relationship has an effect on the effectiveness of leadership. This is particularly true in voluntary organizations like the church. In the church, relationships are based on more interpersonal factors than on offices, duties, or presumed authority. Influence. It is, however, a particular type of relationship. It's based on influence. Imagine that you as a leader are attempting to cause a change in me. Perhaps you want me to agree to something. Now, you could exercise your authority and tell me just do it. And depending on the power you have available, that might work. You might be able to compel me. But if we're looking to change attitudes and orientation to the world, outlook over time, persuasion and influence is one of the key components of leadership. Your arguments may be authoritative to me because of our relationship or the offers that you hold in ways that simply declaring something to be true, just because you say it, would not be. Multidimensional. Next, the quotation suggests that leadership is multidimensional. Sometimes we think of leadership as being entirely top-down, but persuasion is multidimensional, and the unescapable trend revealed in leadership studies is to shared and collaborative leadership. Each part of the system may, but no part holds everything. And the most successful organizations currently are those which have the flattest level of hierarchy and organization. They tend to be small and nimble, and the contributions of all are valued. Change. Finally, a key element of the definition concerns change. Leadership is about change, and in the absence of intention of real change, this definition of leadership collapses. And so one distinction I want to draw to your attention that varies from previous definitions of change is the content or the desire. In other words, why are you leading? What is it in you? What is it that calls leadership forth from you? And this definition, the reason I value it, is because it emphasizes the intent or the desire for real change, focusing on what people mean to accomplish rather than on their success in achieving that goal. You may not reach your goal, but that is not as important in evaluating leadership as the desire to try. Here's another phrase for you. Leaders nurture and sustain conversations directed towards action that help people grow. I've deliberately left the ending open. No one can tell you what the goal and purpose of your leading should be. That's for you and the community to wrestle with the Spirit to discern. I'm not one of those who thinks that the pastor, leader, minister brings the vision and talks people into following it. I really like the idea of leadership as conversation occurring in groups. It may not reach all of the goals that we aspire to in dialogue, but conversation is the goal. Think about the conversations you have in your congregation. There is the central conversation with the Word of God that takes place in worship and study and so on. But conversations go in many directions, and they're crucial for the life of the congregation. They have a power to enrich or diminish, distort, or reinforce communal life. Some people are helped in their thinking by thinking in terms of models. And so I invite you to play with the image of the brain as a possible model for what leadership looks like. It's not particularly churchy as a model, and that's all to the good. You see, in the brain, intelligence is distributed throughout. There are nodes of activity that are, at the same time, global and local. So conversations are going on in many different places at once, in different ways, in different forms, as different groups and teams and ministries focus on their particular part of the church's life. The stronger the corporate DNA, the stronger the common vision, values, and sense of purpose, the more likely that the conversations will be constructive. Another phrase that I cherish is this one of Parker Palmer. I invite you to consider that what we are seeking through our leadership is to create communities of congruence. That may help us continue the conversational mode of leadership in those periods of stress and change, such as are being experienced by many congregations. Anxiety, stress, uncertainty will often cause us as leaders to fall back on patterns that were previously learned or which stem from an earlier phase of development. In such situations, unreflective leaders tend to depend on previously learned knowledge or reactions which may not be constructive. You may think of times when you were under pressure or under stress and you did something and afterwards you thought, gee, I could have done that better. I know how to do that better. So what is it in stress that triggers that previous, less developed behavior? Now, you may be wondering, if I engage in this conversational leadership, am I abdicating my authority as the minister in the congregation? Shouldn't I just be telling folks? Actually, conversations initiated by the minister carry considerable influence. Celia Allison Hahn speaks of pastoral authority, arising from three different sources, and it's important to recognize all of them. Your authority arises externally in connection with the office that you hold. The United Church decided that you would be the minister in this place, whether in terms of a student appointment, a candidate appointment, or an ordained appointment or call. It's the external authority. But there's an internal authority, an authority that comes from your sense of being in this place called by God. And there's an assumed authority which occurs when the minister seizes the moment and initiates some form of action. Let me give you an extreme example. In the event of a fire during worship, somebody who steps up to the microphone and says, "Everybody remain calm. The folks on this side at the front go out that door. The folks at this side on the front go out that door. The rest of you go out the back door, slowly and carefully, and gather in the parking lot." That person has assumed leadership and will have authority. Nobody's going to, or very few people are going to sit around debating whether or not that person has the authority to provide that kind of direction in this kind of crisis. In church life, clergy who are clear about their role and their responsibility are experienced as having authority. That doesn't mean they are always agreed with, but they are experienced as having authority. So, let's talk about authority. Do you see yourself as having authority? What sort of authority and when? Now, I know there are clergy who don't like to think of themselves as having authority. Leadership and authority have all sorts of bad baggage attached to them. But I am firmly convinced, and I've said this to you before, I'm firmly convinced that all clergy have authority. The issue is whether or not we use it poorly or we use it well. You have authority. How will you use it? What are the most important aspects of leadership to those who are following? What qualities of leadership do you think your congregation is looking for in you? The results of surveys about leadership taken over multiple decades in different societies around the world turn up remarkably consistent results. Without exception, the top 4 categories are honest, forward-looking, competent, and inspiring. These characteristics routinely end up in the top 4. None of the other characteristics that we might think of, intelligence, being broad-minded, supported, dependable, determined, self-control, whatever other qualities we might associate with leadership, never find their way into that top 4. So let's look at those very briefly. Honest. In every leadership survey I've ever seen, honesty is selected as one of the most important leadership characteristics by respondents. People can forgive almost anything, including incompetence, if they believe their leader is honest. Other words are character and integrity. So I invite you to take that to heart. Honesty is crucial and it's evaluated by behavior. Regardless of what leaders say, people want to see that there's integrity. Consistency between word and deed is what leads people to believe. The next characteristic is forward-looking. Again, a repeatedly sought-after characteristic, sometimes comes out as a sense of direction, idea of the future of the organization. This is not about autocratic dictatorship, benevolent or otherwise. The vision or idea of the future may be jointly formulated and it needs to be widely owned, but constituents expect their leaders to take that vision and make it live or concrete. So let me ask you, can you imagine or articulate what your congregation will look like in 6 months, 3 years, so on? The desire for competency is huge. To follow someone, we need to believe that person can get us where we're headed. Terms like track record, ability to get things done indicated what's in mind here. It doesn't necessarily refer to a specific activity. Indeed, competence seems to refer to a variety of things depending on the set. An important part of competence seems to be knowing when to ask and who to ask for help. So being able to work with others, people skills if you like, is just one of the most important core competency going. People expect their leaders to be enthusiastic, energetic, positive about the future. That's what it means to be inspiring. Now, we don't want to be fake about it, but if there's nothing in your current ministry situation that inspires you, then you need to give some serious reflection to your capacity to lead in that context. Inspiring leadership speaks to followers about the need to have meaning and purpose in our lives, that what we're doing has some impact. This is important at any time, but when we're leading in times of uncertainty, it's crucial to moving people upward and forward. When people are worried, when they are discouraged, frightened, or uncertain, the last thing they need is a leader who feeds negative emotions. Instead, we need leaders who communicate that we will overcome, that it may not be easy, it may not be simple, it may not be clear, but we will overcome because God is with us. And so I'd like you to take a moment right now and jot down some of your most personal, positive models of inspiration. All of which brings us to the first commandment of leadership, which is credibility. More than anything else, people want leaders to be credible. And credible can be defined in a number of ways, but behaviorally, it looks like this. DWYSYWD. Do what you say you will do. The next stage of being leaders of insight is to understand the operative theology of our community of faith. Many congregations today operate on a functional theology of scarcity rather than abundance, of doubt rather than faith, of fear rather than hope. Think about the community of faith you know best and see if that's true. What's even worse is when we as leaders get caught up in it and we feed that dismal outlook. So here we have attitudes that have to be addressed and challenged before change is really possible in a congregation. I'm not suggesting a Pollyanna attitude. I'm not suggesting that all our problems will go away if we have a positive attitude and whistle a happy song. But attitudes are part of survival and thriving. I'm not talking about the power of positive thinking. Rather, I'm talking about living and believing what we so often claim, that God is with us. We are not alone. And it's one of my core theological beliefs that God provides for God's people everything they need to be faithful to God's call in the world. The challenge is often discerning a God's call from our own desires. So with those core things in mind, what do we need to do to lead through change? Why is it so difficult? Well, let me give you a reason. Why do things never change? Bear with me. The North American Railroad gauge, that is, the distance between the rails, is 4 feet 8.5 inches. You will acknowledge that that's an odd sort of measurement, 4 feet 8.5 inches. Why that number? Well, because that's the way railways were made in England. And US and Canadian railroads were, for the most part, built by English expatriates. Why did the English build them that way? Because the first railways were built by those who constructed the pre-railway tramways. That's the gauge they used. Why? Because people who built the tramways used the same jigs and tools for building wagons that used that spacing. All right, already. Why did the wagons use such odd wheel spacing? Because if they tried to employ any other spacing, wagons would break on some of the long-distance roads because that's with the spacing of the wheel ruts. All right, so who built the old rutted roads? The first long-distance roads in Europe were built by the Roman imperial army for the benefit of their legions and have been used ever since. The initial ruts, which everyone had to match for fear of destroying their wagons, were first made by imperial war chariots, which, because they were all made in or by imperial Rome, were alike in spacing. There you have it. The standard US and Canadian railroad gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches derives from the original specification of the imperial war chariot. Specifications and bureaucracies live forever. Now, for many people, the instinctive reaction is that church and faith represent stability. For most people, God is the unchanging center, and if that is the case, what sort of theological expression will that have? And what will be the instinctive theological and spiritual response to change? Actually, it's not that simple. Research indicates that in any group of people confronted with change, 15% will be positive embracers, 35% will be positive adapters, 35% will be negative adapters, 15% will be negative refusers. Well, who are these people? Well, you may very well be able to put faces on them. Positive embracers welcome change. They're constantly making change in life. They welcome growth and challenge. They're always looking over the next hill. And in terms of your change project, they can bring a lot of necessary energy. The positive adapters, they've generally had good experience with change. They accept at theoretical levels the need to change, and they can see the possibilities when they are laid out clearly. They do value the past and traditions. They can see some of the pitfalls, real or imagined, about change. They are concerned about the effect on community, and they may or may not be conflict avoiders, which is an important factor in considering change. Negative adapters have had some poor or painful experience. They resist at the theoretical level the need to change. Why do we need to change at all? They can be persuaded, but they don't like to be stampeded. They fear the crowd mentality. Don't ever tell them everyone thinks this way. They value the past and tradition and therefore must seek continuity in the change. They can be very important allies if brought on side. I remember a couple of instances where people who were very much opposed to pre-authorized remittance, in other words, given by par, once they were persuaded of it and could be persuaded to talk to other people about that, were very powerful in moving a lot of people onto par because they were seen as good examples. They are very much concerned with the credibility of the people suggesting change. And then you have your negative refusers. Folk who never met a change they didn't hate. They often have very legitimate negative experiences about change. They may see the church as the last bastion of stability in a confusing and often incomprehensible world. They are quite prepared to embrace the death of the church as a credible alternative to change. They aren't afraid of conflict. They may or may not stay if the community decides to change. They cannot be argued into change, but they must be dealt with pastorally and caringly for the change process. Because if those who are on the fence see you kicking the negative refusers to the curb or even seeming to ignore them, your change process will have difficulty. So what do we know? Each group will make different... So what do we know? Each group makes meaning out of life in different ways. Each will in its turn place meaning in different practices. Those practices may come to take on an object and apparently independent status. The members in turn respond to that reality that they have created. Let me give you an example. Perhaps in your sanctuary there is a pulpit Bible. It really gets in your way of your notes when you're trying to preach. You might argue objectively that the purpose of the pulpit is for the proclamation of the word, and you are not disposing of the scriptures if you simply move them in order to be able to preach more effectively. However, for some members of your congregation, it's not a matter of logic. What they perceive as the objective reality conveyed by the Bible on the pulpit is more important than anything else. So negotiating that change will require some very real care, not simply stating the utilitarian need for a clean preaching service. So, let's assume that you are seeking to lead a change. What are some of the tools at your disposal? What can you do to lead change? I'd like you to stop the recording and make a list. How would you answer the question? If you wanted to lead change in your congregation right now, what are some of the things that you can use? Okay, we're back. Here are some of the best tools in the minister's toolkit. Spend time. Spending time exerts in itself a claim on the decision-making system. If you keep raising the issue, if you keep devoting time to the issue, if you keep exploring the issue, the sheer amount of time over time exerts a claim on the decision-making system. Persist. Have more patience than other people. It often results in the adoption of a course of action. One of the gurus in leadership studies, Ronald Heifetz, suggests that one of the tools in a leadership toolbox is the ability to shape the conversation. If you can keep the conversation coming back to that issue and persist in that, you may have more success. Facilitate opposition participation. It's often true that those outside the formal decision centers overestimate the feasibility of change. Encouraged to participate, they will become more realistic. What that means is that the more people you incorporate in not only the decision, but the process of change, the more people understand what you're trying to do. And even if they don't agree with it, or even if they wish you were moving faster, they may have greater sympathy with the challenge of making change. Provide garbage cans. Organizations argue endlessly about issues. You may want to put in some throwaway issues at the top of the agenda to absorb debate, saving substantive issues until later. It's often important to allow people to say no before they say yes. Many people in churches are inclined to say no for a variety of reasons. Let them say no and have that no honored, and so they can say yes later on. Interpret history. By articulating a particular version of events, the leader can influence people's perceptions. Whoever writes the minutes influences the outcome. What I mean by that is reaching back into the story of that particular group of people and taking a story that is told and articulating it in a different way. So, for instance, if in that congregation there's a great bemoaning going on of how few children there are in the Sunday school, why not take the story and look at the reality of the circumstances around that golden time? Was it about the population? Was it about the demographics? Was it about the lack of other alternative activities? Was it about social legislation? What was it around that time? And then retell the story about the church's involvement in the life of the wider community. Not just the specific size of the Sunday school, but the meaningful participation in the life of the wider community, and talk about how that can be taken up. You're articulating a particular version of events, and you can influence your people's perception. I want to look with you now at some of the dynamics of change and leading change in an organization. Gilbert Rendell's book, Leading Change in the Congregation, is by far the most accessible text on the subject for most of us. And what is most significant, the roller coaster of change and the attendant emotions. Imagine this is a particularly bumpy roller coaster. What happens? The change is announced. There are difficult feelings. We have the task of letting go of what was, and then we decide to stick with it, which is either the community or the action of change. Or we leave. Then we begin to see actions supportive of change. We reform the purpose and structure. We have feelings of hope as this change takes hold and moves us ahead. Take a look at these emotions. Shock, mourning, fight, flight, disorientation, remembering the good old days, turmoil. We begin to distance from others. There's detachment. Each in our own way, we determine how to let go. Then comes the commitment and the buy-in. And as the change takes further steps, excitement, testing, hope, we find we can solve problems. We search for the new. The challenge, the graph is plotted with energy levels on the vertical scale and time on the horizontal. So, announcing a change often brings with it a flurry of energy, and our plans and dreams start to take place. And obviously, this is a general model, and specific cases will differ. But negative feelings will start to arise, and dealing with those negative feelings tends to drag the energy level, particularly for those who are leading change, downward. There comes a crucial moment where, assuming that the change is going to go forward, individuals have to accept the change and decide to stick with the congregation or depart. The reality is that most people make these decisions for different reasons and different timescales. And when most people have bought in, there will still be some people sniping. And if you're the leader, I'm sure you're going to be wondering, when are these people ever going to get off the pot? But now the energy starts to rise. Probably, if you're an astute leader, you've arranged for some small victories. When you're planning change, try and build in some small accomplishments along the way. They create forward momentum. People can see where the change is taking the congregation, and it may be time to restructure the congregation or somehow institutionalize the change. We can really do this thing. We also have to take stock of the feelings that people go through as they go through the change. the announcement of the change, what people feel as they're going down the slope. The challenge is that leaders have often been through the roller coaster well ahead of those in the congregation. Leaders are headed up one side while most in the body are heading down the other. And here's where we often make some crucial mistakes in fostering change. We respond to the feelings that are being expressed with facts and details. That's rarely helpful. The person on the downward slope may be expressing their feelings in what sounds like fact language. But if we go to 2 services, how will we get enough school teachers? What they're really saying is, this is going to change the feel of my congregation. So what do we need to do? We need to provide lots of opportunity for people to express their feelings, particularly the negative ones, in a safe environment. As change agents, we need to restrain our enthusiasm so that we can validly minister to all people. We have to be cognizant that when people express what sounds like negative feeling, it may not indicate negative response, but grieving over change of what has been familiar and nurturing to them. 1 or 2 final thoughts about change. Whenever possible, add rather than subtract. By this I mean, if you want a different style of worship service, add it, and don't take away from the existing service. If you want to have a different style of spiritual growth group, add it, don't cancel the traditional Bible study. If you need to stop doing something, and that's an action we don't often accomplish well within the church, do it in a way that absorbs it into the greater whole rather than need to. 1 or 2 final thoughts about change. Wherever possible, add rather than subtract. By that I mean, if you want a different style of worship service, add it. Don't take away the existing service, at least not initially. If you want to have a different style of spiritual growth group, add it. Don't cancel the traditional Bible study. If you need to stop doing something, and stopping something is an action we don't accomplish well in the church very often, try to do it in a way that absorbs whatever was being done into the greater whole, rather than dismissing or diminishing what needs to stop. Using a scornful attitude to what you need to draw to a close is not helpful. Remember that if everyone agrees with your change, you probably aren't changing anything. There will always be some fallout, whatever change occurs. What we need to do is recall some strategies. Here are some strategies that have proven successful in working for change. Don't give the negative voices the deciding vote. Because we fear conflict more than just about anything else, we often shape the discussion so that negative voices have the last and the loudest word. The negative voices are often those of common sense and prudence and all sorts of other things. Well, those voices need to be honored, but no more than those voices that say, let's go forward in faith. Because withdrawal and flight, fight, or freeze reactions are common in change times, a second goal is to try and create safe spaces where people can encounter one another and maintain contact. So there needs to be places where people can connect with one another and they don't have to be dealing with that particular issue. You don't want to split the congregation into an us and them sort of situation, or you will always lose, even if you win your point. The third is to give people information and do it over and over and over and over and over again. When you give people information about change or about a new beginning, be as concrete as you can about it and what their place in the new reality will be. Mark endings and let them be the end. To use an example, if you've decided to change from one hymn book to another, Get the old ones out of the pews, put them in a box, don't dig them out. Mark endings and let them be the end. Don't keep lurching back to the old practices. If you are a change leader or a leadership team, make sure that you have a support network or a place where you can deal with your emotions in a safe and non-destructive way. Ensure some early wins. Try and develop a change process with stages where you can actually have some wins at the beginning, but celebrate each success. Try and ensure some early wins. Change is difficult, but change is constant. Change is something that you will be dealing with all the time. You need to look at your feelings around change, whether it's your comfort level or your capacity. Think about how you can continue to lead change in these times, because that's where we're called to give leadership. God bless.